Hello and welcome back to the Training Tom podcast, the place where I share the lessons I have learned, the challenges I'm currently facing, and the questions I have for my future self. And today's episode is simply me sharing some thoughts. So let's get into it. We have reached double digits. This is episode 10 of the podcast. And yeah, I thought I would do something a little bit different today. I would share some thoughts that I've made notes of. And it's been thoughts that I've had just randomly, but also thoughts that I might have had from listening to different podcasts and speaking to different people. And I tend to make a note of these on my phone just so that I can refer back to them in the future. And I think what I'm going to do is every time I hit a little bit of a milestone, I've hit double digits. This is the 10th episode. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to share some of these thoughts in today's episode. But I think every time I hit a little milestone, I'll do something similar because I'm constantly making notes of things on my phone or writing things down in my journal. So it's interesting for me in particular to reflect on these thoughts and to look back on them, but also it might be interesting for you. So without further ado, let's get into things. So the first round of thoughts that I've made a note of is about paradoxes. And I just want to read out some of these paradoxes and then just tell a story within one of these paradoxes too, but also maybe just have a bit of time reflecting on these paradoxes as well. So the first paradox that I made a note of is when we are young, we want to be old, but when we are old or when we are older, we want to be young again. The second one is we want options, but having too many options makes us indecisive. Third, we chase happiness, but if we were always happy, would we know what happiness felt like? Fourth, we chase money to make us happy, but we never seem to have enough money to make us happy. And lastly, overthinkers spend so much time thinking about what they could do that they never act on any of those thoughts. And these paradoxes were very interesting for me. And it was just one day I was sitting downstairs and it just, dawned on me that there are many paradoxes in life. And we often, just don't necessarily consider them so much. And I'm going to kick things off with that first one. When we are young, we want to be old. When we are older, we want to be young again. And I remember when I was a teenager, I was always thinking, I can't wait to be 18 so that I can go out clubbing, I can maybe drink alcohol, I can do things that adults always, or I say always seem to do, but do the fun things that adults seem to do. Then when I was 18, I was thinking, I can't wait to be 21 and I've finished uni and I've got a job and I can save up for a house and I can try and buy my own property. And then when I was 21, I was thinking, I can't wait to be 25 and I've established my career and I've, made it a bit further in my workplace. I'm earning more money and maybe I can finally buy that property. And then I got to 25 and I was thinking, man, what I would give to be 18 or even 14 or 15 again and going through my GCSEs, life seems so much simpler then. And I imagine it only gets more profound as you get older. And I think this thought, I can't remember exactly where this thought came from, but I think it was from a quote from Jimmy Carr. And he was on a podcast that I listened to and he mentioned that let's say you're in your 40s or you're in your 50s, you would give up everything you have in your 40s or your 50s to be 20 years younger again, or to be the age that I am now and have this health, this fitness, this enthusiasm, this energy that I have at this moment in time, I would give all of that up. I would give up everything that I owned, all of the things I'd accumulated when I'm in my 40s and 50s, to be the age that I am at this moment in time. So that was quite profound for me to just reflect on and to think, like, am I perhaps making the most of the time that I have right now? Am I making the most of the fitness and the health that I have right now? I think with the challenges or the fitness challenge that I've set myself this year, I think yes, perhaps I am. But also just reminding myself of that as I get older, that the health that I have at this moment in time, the fitness that I have at this moment in time, not to take that for granted, because in 20, 30 plus years time, I will probably wish I had the fitness and the health that I have currently. So the second one, we want options, but having too many makes us indecisive. It comes back to that paradox of choice that I've spoken about in a previous episode. We often want lots of options. And I think this is ever more prevalent in the world of dating, in that dating apps give us so many options, but then perhaps we become indecisive and we don't commit to anyone, or we don't give somebody time and energy, and we're always looking for somebody better. And that's something that has become, or as was highlighted to me when I was perhaps using dating apps, and I'm not using dating apps at the moment. And I actually feel a lot better about that, and feel that I'm not kind of overwhelmed with choice and with option. I'm perhaps a bit more careful with who I want to interact with, who I want to speak to, and perhaps who I consider forming a relationship with, and maybe even give it more thought and give it more time and more energy, so that I can try and commit to a person, and I can try to develop a relationship without lots of outside noise going on. And the next two, we chase happiness, but if we were always happy, would we know what happiness felt like? And we chase money to make us happy, but never seem to have enough money to be happy. These two are really interesting, and these were brought on from a story that I heard from another podcast. And this story has been kind of paraphrased in a number of different ways, but I've kind of made a note of it, of my version and my interpretation of that story. And it's the story of the Mexican fisherman and the American businessman. So a fisherman gets back to shore with his small boat, and an American businessman sees him and says, "Wow, there's some big fish." He then asks how long the fisherman spent fishing and what he'll do for the rest of the day, because at this point it was quite early in the day when he'd stopped fishing and when he'd come back onto shore. The fisherman turned around to the businessman and said, "I've been out fishing for a few hours and I've caught enough fish to feed my family. I'll now head home and I'll cook the fish and I'll eat with my family and spend a bit of time with them. Then I'll have a nap with my wife, and in the afternoon I'll spend some more time playing with my children." The businessman then says, "That's stupid. You should spend more time fishing and be out on the sea for even longer. Think of how many more fish you'd be able to catch." And the fisherman turns around and says, "What would I do with that?" The businessman then replies saying, "Well, with the extra fish that you've caught, you could go to market and you could sell that extra fish, and then you'd have extra money." Again, the fisherman says, "What would I do with that?" The businessman replies saying, "Well, with that extra money, you could employ some friends. So your friends and you could then go out onto the sea, you could have more boats, you could catch more fish, and then you could sell even more fish at the market and you'll have even more money." Again, the fisherman turns around and says, "Well, what would I do with that?" The businessman then carries on and he says, "Well, then you could buy some bigger boats. You could bring the business to America. You could incorporate your company, buy lots of factories, and with the extra fish that you're now catching in the bigger boats that you've got, you could even start canning that fish, and then you could create a global empire of canned fish that you could sell all around the world and make even more money. The fisherman then repeats the same question. And what would I do with that? Or why would I do that? The businessman carries on with this analogy of being able to make lots of money and one day perhaps float his company on the stock exchange. He could then sell all of his shares in the company and retire to the village that he used to live in. Again, the fisherman questions and goes, well, why would I do that? And the businessman finishes his story by saying, well, once you've sold your company and you have all the money you could ever dream of, you could buy a nice house down by the seaside or by the beach. You could then go out in the morning, spend a few hours fishing, bring back enough fish to feed your family, cook that fish with your family, spend some time with them in the late morning and early afternoon, take a nap with your wife, and then after you've had that nap, you could spend the rest of the day playing with your children. And the fisherman is confused by this, and again asks, why would I do that? Because the life that he is currently living is exactly the same place that the businessman suggested he would be able to get to. Why would he go through all of that process to be doing exactly the same thing when he is as happy now as he would be at the end of that journey? Perhaps even happier in his current moment and current state than by going through all of that process. And I think it gives a lot of perspective to the lives that we live. Are we, first of all, truly being present in what we're doing? And are we trying to find happiness in the life that we're currently leading? And if we're not, then are we chasing something in order to validate us being able to be happy? Or are we chasing something in order to find happiness at the end of that chase? It's a question perhaps for all of us to reflect on, but I find that story quite profound to think about. And the last paradox, overthinkers spend so much time thinking about what they could do that they never actually take action on those thoughts. And this is more from my own personal experience, where I often try and think of every possible scenario going into a situation, that perhaps I then avoid the situation because I haven't got all of the answers. Perhaps it's to do with the fear of failure. Perhaps it's to do with perfectionism. But historically, throughout my life, I feel like I haven't taken action on things because I've been thinking about all of the things that I could be doing or all of the options that are available to me, that I never actually make a decision and I never truly act on the things that I'm doing. And I'm hoping that by starting this podcast and by now being 10 episodes in, I'm slowly starting to provide myself with evidence that I can change that mentality and I can, yes, use my thoughts wisely, but more importantly, I can take action and start doing things rather than thinking about them all of the time instead. So those are some interesting paradoxes to consider, and perhaps you can think of some paradoxes of your own. And if you do think of those, do feel free to share them with me, and I would perhaps include them, or I will perhaps include them in a future episode, and we can all reflect on them as a group and as listeners. The next thing is a question that I ask myself, and it's a question around why I have set myself such challenges, why I do the things that I do. And again, it was born from listening to a podcast and what the podcast host sharing their perspective on why they do things. And the question is, am I chasing things because they are valuable, or am I chasing them because they are difficult to get? Am I chasing things because they are valuable, or am I chasing them because they are difficult to get? And the bullet point that I have underneath that question is this linked to me not feeling like I am enough? If I chase things because they are difficult to get, let's say it's a house or a particular possession like an expensive watch or a brand new car. Am I chasing those things because I perceive them to be valuable? Or am I chasing them because I consider them to be difficult to get? And if they are difficult to get, once I get those things, does it then make me feel like I am enough? And this also raised a question around my fitness challenge. Am I doing this fitness challenge because I think it is a valuable experience for me to do the challenge? Or am I doing it because I think it is difficult to achieve? Now, for those of you that don't know what that fitness challenge is, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. I have given it a bit of thought, and I do feel like it is going to be a valuable experience for me. I feel like the process of trying to achieve this challenge, as one of my friends said to me, battling between whether I will finish or if I'm going to finish. I think I mentioned in that episode when I get to the finish line, and then continued on to say if I get to the finish line. So the value will be in potentially my mentality towards that. And when I get to the finish line, what lessons I've learnt along the way and how I can interpret those lessons as well. I do, however, think there is the question of striving towards this challenge to make myself feel like I am enough. And I mentioned that in the episode, but I do think there is some validity in that argument as well, that I am chasing this fitness challenge in the hope that it makes me feel like I am enough, perhaps to the external world, but also towards myself as well. It almost gives me justification to say I am enough, rather than just telling myself that without giving myself any evidence. But then that opens up another can of worms. Do I need to provide myself evidence to show that I am enough? Maybe that's a question that I can answer another time. The third point in my thoughts and in the notes that I have is, who are you? Or who am I? What is your identity, and is it defined by one thing? Now, for a very long time, my identity was wrapped up in the work that I did. In fact, I would say my identity has been defined by the work that I do ever since I started university. I started university, my identity was that I was a student. I finished university, my identity was that I was a healthcare assistant. I moved on from being a healthcare assistant, and my identity was that I was a personal trainer. And now, or should I say 6 months ago, my identity was that I was a fitness educator, or that I was a training instructor. And I placed a lot of my own value on the work that I did. Then when I went through a bit of a challenge at work, it really made me question who I am. Because I've put so much energy, so much time, and placed so much value on the work that I did, and the work that I currently do, I often placed my own value and the definition of who I am on the work that I did. And then that was placed into question because, for those of you that don't know, I was put at risk of being made redundant. And it made me realize that in a big organization, you might be considered an integral part of the team that you work in, possibly even the department that you work in. But outside of that, you are just a number on a spreadsheet and you are expendable. So if I place all of my value in the work that I do, when that gets potentially taken away, who am I? And this has perhaps led me to make some changes that I have made recently and led me to try and establish a better work-life balance as well. I'm actually working really hard to get a much better work-life balance, to, at this moment in time, actually spend more of my time and energy prioritizing my personal life outside of work, developing personal relationships, developing romantic relationships, trying to look after my health, prioritize my fitness, or prioritize my health as well. Do activities that support my mental health and my physical health. Do activities that bring me joy and happiness that are not related to the work that I do, and simply give me extra things to define who I am, so that I'm not defined by one thing, so that there are many things that I class as part of me as a person, and many things that can define me as well. But I also feel it's much simpler than that. And I had a conversation with I'm going to say my barber, but he's not my sole barber. I go to a barber's and I see the same person every time. I consider him to be a good friend of mine now. And Ash and I, who is my barber, we always have very in-depth conversations that are quite philosophical, and I always walk away from those conversations feeling so refreshed, so energized, and so positive as well. And it's great for me that I can have those conversations with Ash, and I hope he enjoys those conversations as well. One of the things that we spoke about a number of months ago now was just this concept of the I. Who am I? And focusing on the I. You don't necessarily need to be anything. You just are. You're alive. Or if you think of who am I, it might just simply be I am. And there's nothing that follows the am. You just are. That was quite an interesting conversation for me, and quite profound as well. And it's linked to a podcast that Jonny Wilkinson has that has nothing to do with rugby. And his podcast is called the I Am Podcast. And he talks about trying to remove those labels that we place on ourselves and just simply be. Be a person. Live. I am. Focusing on the am and just living life, rather than placing a label and an identity onto who you are. So that was very interesting, and again, made me do a lot of reflecting, made me think about, and perhaps it was because I was in that particular time where my work identity had been placed into question. I think it was around that time that Ash and I had that conversation, so it was very timely, you might say, and I'm a great believer in things happening for a reason, and perhaps that conversation happened at the right time for me to consider those things and start to perhaps make some changes of how I perceive my identity. The penultimate thing that I have on my notes is you have to do something different to do something different. And I've got some bullet points underneath that as well. Doing the same thing doesn't change anything. You might have heard of there's a quote that is often what's the word that I'm looking for? I'm going to say misquoted as being a quote from Albert Einstein, where insanity, the quote is, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I've actually Googled this quote because A, I love that quote, and B, I wanted to make sure that I was quoting it from the right person. And it turns out it wasn't quoted by Albert Einstein. It was quoted by somebody else. And I did look up who it was, but I can't for the life of me remember who that person is. And I also don't think there is any, I think when I was doing some research into it, actually, there is no recorded person who has mentioned that quote. But I'm just going to say it's a quote that is out there in the world, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So you have to do something different to do something different. I think this note came from listening to a podcast episode from Chris Williamson, the Modern Wisdom podcast that I've mentioned plenty of times before. You have to do something different to do something different. It might feel uncomfortable, but doing something different is more likely to bring a different outcome. And if it doesn't bring a different outcome, the chances are you would have learned something new, so it's a win-win. Doing the same thing is not going to change anything, but doing something different, regardless of the outcome, will teach you something along the way. So sometimes in fact, a lot of the time, doing something different is going to prove beneficial than not changing anything at all. Again, another profound thing to think about. And I liked the way that Chris phrased it, in that you have to do something different to do something different. That repetition of do something different, because that just drums home that ultimately you have to do something different. And lastly, I have societal expectations. And I know that this links back to an episode I released a few weeks ago around you are where you need to be. Societal expectations, I've noted understanding why I'm doing something and whether it is what I want to do, or I'm doing it because I feel like I should be doing it. This is perhaps linked to me looking to move out of my family home. Perhaps linked to the fitness challenge that I've set myself. Linked to career development, all of the things that I see other people doing at the age that I am, or a very similar age to me, and that comparison coming into play. I've mentioned before, comparison is the thief of joy. The grass is greener where you water it. And I feel like this very much comes into that category as well. Why am I doing something? Am I doing something because I want to do it, or am I doing something because I feel like I should be doing it? Another question that comes up from that is my aim to have short-term gratification or long-term fulfillment? The long-term fulfillment side of things is something that I'm striving towards at this moment in time. Not thinking so much about short-term gratification, but thinking more about the long-term implications, or the longer-term fulfillment that I will achieve from the things that I'm doing in the short term, whether I find them challenging or not. And I've noted that down, some questions to ask myself in future decisions as well. If I am thinking that I'm doing something because of societal expectations, or if I want to question why I am doing something, then questions that I can ask are, what is the purpose of this? Is it something that will give me short-term gratification but long-term pain? And in 10 years' time, will this decision have an impact on my life? I think these are some good questions that we can all ask ourselves when we are making big decisions, but also some of those smaller decisions as well, because the small decisions sometimes lead into bigger habits. So things like exercising and going to the gym, all of those things can, if we are not doing those things in the short term, can very much lead to long-term pain, but it might be short-term gratification because you don't feel up to doing something, or maybe you just don't want to do something that day, or don't have the motivation. Like, motivation is a huge thing as well. I don't have the motivation today, so I won't do that. I won't do X, or I won't do a particular thing. But then if you don't have the motivation the next day, you've then given yourself evidence, given yourself an excuse not to do something again. And I think we have to, or I've mentioned this in a previous episode, we have to do uncomfortable and difficult things sometimes to become fulfilled. I come back to a quote that I shared in a previous episode. Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. We have to do uncomfortable things sometimes to live a fulfilling life and to live a meaningful life. So asking ourselves questions like, is it something that will give me short-term gratification but long-term pain? And in 10 years' time, will this decision have an impact on my life? Can be really useful for the big decisions that we make in our life, but also the small decisions as well. And that brings us nicely to the end of this episode. I hope you found that useful. I found it really enjoyable coming back to these thoughts, because a lot of the time I'll make notes on my phone and I'll just add to a list of thoughts, and I'll spend a bit of time thinking about them in the moment, but I won't necessarily come back to them and spend any more time thinking about them. So it's been really enjoyable for me actually to look back on these thoughts and remember where those thoughts came from, why I had those thoughts in the first place, and just spend a bit of time confirming my own perspective on these thoughts. And that perspective might change, it might shift as I get older and as I get into different situations. But yeah, it's been enjoyable for me just to share those thoughts and gain clarity on my own thinking. Perhaps it's been useful for you as well to question some of the things that you do, or to just simply remind yourself of some of those paradoxes in life that we have, or to just, reflect on some of the thoughts that you have as well. Maybe me sharing my thoughts and how I make notes on my thoughts, the thing that you've taken away from this is that that's something that you would like to do as well. Yeah, I've certainly enjoyed this episode. I hope you have as well. But I'm going to bring this to a close. So this has been Just Some Thoughts. My name is Tom Regan, and as always, this is the Training Tom podcast.